so about a week and a half ago, I started this project, the Stinky Meat Project, with my friend. We started it last Thursday, and it lasted for 10 days, ending today, on Saturday. Now, there were a previous Stinky Meat Project, which is what this was based on. Some guy decided to just rot some meat in his neighbor's yard. We used my backyard, because we didn't want to get in trouble with anybody. And his lasted for 19 days, before the neighbors picked it up. But he also then did a second one, which lasted for 20 days. And then a couple other people did a third one in a college dorm, which lasted for 21. As I believe I already mentioned, ours only lasted for 10. It was a lot shorter. But ours was the first one with video, and the first one to fully reach completion. All the others were either taken by an animal or cleaned up. The reason we ended ours is because the maggots had pretty much eaten the entire thing. There wasn't really anything left to be shown. But I would still like to show you the progress of the meats over the last 10 days. And warning, as you might expect, it's kind of gross. Alright, so I didn't mention this, but the idea of the project was that we would just get some meat and watch it rot and make an update of it each day. So day one we went to Cub, bought a chicken, a piece of trout, a lamb chop, and 2 steaks. We then unpacked them all, set them on these 2 boards that were made out of like a signpost with boards duct taped onto them, with then paper plates duct taped onto those boards, and then we just set each of the meats on their own plate. Well, the 2 steaks shared a plate, but nevertheless. So the first day they obviously weren't too gross because we were just setting it up. Now day 2, flies started coming. Like the whole wing of the chicken, well, specifically if you're looking at the front of the chicken, your right of that wing, covered in flies. Just tons of flies on there. And while I didn't point it out in the video, I noticed that they actually started laying some maggots there. They laid some maggot eggs there. There weren't many flies on the lamb, although underneath I did notice some maggot eggs. Not that, again, didn't mention it in the video. Also on the steak. Didn't notice any maggot eggs, but there were a few flies on there. The trout, we found out was cooked, as I believe I mentioned. So really, no change there. We also started poking tests, where we pretty much picked up a stick and started poking the meat to see how rigid they were. The trout was about the same, but the other meats, the steak, chicken, and lamb, all got a bit tougher. They were more rigid that day. Now, day 3, there weren't as many flies, but the wing on the chicken, where all the flies were, covered in maggots. And, as I pointed out in the video, they kind of looked like sawdust. But yeah, just tons of maggots on the chicken. Also, under the lamb, still maggots there. The flies, though, generally kind of moved over off on the steak. There were still a few flies, and they kind of focused on the steaks now. However, these steaks were becoming increasingly smaller, shriveling up, and becoming increasingly darker. Like they're now more of a brown, blackish. The lamb is becoming a bloodier red, kind of darker, slightly more sickly color. The trout is, again, uninfected. It's smoked. It's going to stay like that for a while. I'll go ahead and tell you that now. The chicken, it's a bit darker. Not a whole lot changed. But yeah, overall, mainly just a bunch of maggot eggs on the chicken, which is a noticeable thing. And the meats are getting more rigid, tougher, which is a fairly common theme. Alright, so day 4, the trout, again, still mostly unaffected, and it's going to be pretty constant. The lamb, it looked like there were, the maggots were receding under it, and as I guessed that day, and later found out to be true, the maggots were actually eating the underside, so they were kind of burrowing underneath and eating it from the inside out. And we also noticed when the poking test it was a bit squishier, which in hindsight might be because when poking it, the lamb had something to squish into, the cavities that the maggots created. The chicken, you thought there were a lot of maggots yesterday, covered in maggots today, even more. They're not just in the wing, they're all around the plate, they're in the hole I mentioned the day before, just tons of maggots on the chicken. And it's also pretty tough when you touch it. The steak looked smaller, but it looked like there were a whole lot of maggots on it. However, as like the lamb, which we find out later, the maggots were actually burrowing underneath it and eating the inside. However, the steak was still rigid when poked. Also, the flies returned. There was a brief lull in the flies the day before, and there were a bunch of flies, mainly on the steaks. And it was at this point that we started to put my dad's hypothesis to the test, where fly amount has something to do with the weather, i.e. sunny, more flies, cloudier, less flies. It was day 1, we don't really remember, day 2 was kind of sunny, day 3 was kind of cloudy, and day 4 was sunny. So we started keeping track of that. Also, a smell started, just a mild, fishy smell though. Now, day 5, we noticed that the lamb and steak have actually moved a bit. The trout, still pretty much the same. The lamb, aside from looking a bit darker, was now slid farther off the plate. At the time, we didn't know what this was, but a few days later, my mom proposed the hypothesis, which I later found out to be true the next day, is that the maggots were actually kind of writhing around, jostling the meats, in this case the lamb and the steak, causing them to start to slide down the plate and almost off the table. So it was actually the maggots moving around that caused the lamb and steak to move. We nevertheless pushed it back. The steak didn't look a whole lot different, maybe smaller, maybe darker, but there were still maggots underneath, although it didn't seem like many, and we didn't notice it at this time. The chicken, however, there didn't seem to be more maggots, but the maggots got a lot bigger. They definitely grew in size, and so now the chicken just looks like it's taken over even more. And we also noticed at this point that the chicken was now flattening out and kind of, spreading out widthwise. So it wasn't nearly as plump, and this was doing this the whole time, but it wasn't really until today that we started noticing that the chicken was actually flattening out. And also, unsurprisingly, the chicken was pretty squishy when poked, again, because the maggots probably ate the inside, like they did the lamb the day before. The lamb, however, was still rigid, again, like the steaks. The steaks are pretty constantly rigid. Also, smell, just a slightly stronger fish smell. Alright, now day 6, the meat started falling off the table. The lamb and the chicken fell off the table. Again, at the time we didn't know why, but we later find out it's from the maggots causing it to move. We picked both the lamb and the chicken up, flipped the lamb over, and we noticed that the entire underside was kind of like very eaten out. There wasn't a whole lot left to the underside, which proved my hypothesis that the maggots were going underneath the lamb and eating it from the inside. The steaks were slid down, but they still looked unaffected. However, the same thing happening to the lamb was actually happening to the steaks. The chicken, then, that also fell off, and there were just tons of maggots. I didn't necessarily notice a whole lot more from yesterday, because there were a ton of maggots yesterday, but there were definitely more maggots on it, and started to look just more decomposed, sicklier, flatter. Also, I noticed some poop on the chicken. So the maggots have started pooping on the chicken, as well as also burrowing underneath the chicken's skin. So that added to a poop smell, as well as a still overarching fish smell. Now, day 7, all the meats but the trout fell off the table. Again, we still didn't know why. The chicken, this time, completely collapsed. There were definitely less maggots on there from yesterday, because when we picked up the plate, tons of maggots. When we picked up the plate this time, not so many maggots. But at this point, after we picked it up and set it back on the table, using sticks, we didn't actually touch it, we noticed that it's pretty much just kind of skin and bones. I mean, it looked really just like skin and bones at this point. As we continue on, it looks even more just like skin and bones. But yeah, there wasn't a whole lot left to the chicken at this point, and so that's probably why there weren't any maggots. The chicken was pretty much eaten at this point. The lamb actually split apart a bit when it fell off, which just shows that its structural integrity was weakened by it being out on the inside. Otherwise, it didn't look a whole lot different, aside from being a bit more eaten. The steak, however, we noticed a big change, because that's when they fell off, the steaks flipped over, and we noticed that the maggots had actually eaten through the inside of the steak, and were in fact, the maggots were in fact on the steak, and not leaving it alone, as I previously suspected, but they were just eating on the inside and through the steaks. The smell, however, there was still the fish smell, but it rained the night before, and so we think that washed away the poop smell, because that wasn't nearly as noticeable. Now, day 8, the maggots have pretty much finished off the lamb, as well as the chicken, and, as we find out, it had been knocked to the ground, the steak. The maggots kind of just left this hairy-looking mass of meat, we think. It was weird. It honestly kind of looked like this coarse hair, but it was steak. That's just what the maggots didn't eat. They otherwise left it alone. However, the trout was actually affected this time, because the maggots apparently got to the trout, moved around so much that they knocked it off, and then when the trout fell, it kind of broke apart. I do think due partly to the maggots probably eating it and weakening it, but also partly because fish isn't the sturdiest thing, structurally at least. So the maggots actually got to the fish. The smell, though, overarchingly was still a mild, fishy smell. Day 9, the steak, lamb, and chicken don't look any different. I mean, the lamb and chicken hadn't moved from a couple days ago. They still kind of look like goop at this point. I mean, with the chicken you can kind of tell the skin, but largely goop. And then the steak still looks like that hairy-ish mass that, again, hasn't moved from the plate. The fish, however, is now gone. Like, all that was left was this little fin. The skin was gone, the rest of the bones and all the meat were gone. I'm guessing an animal probably got to that, because we did leave it on the ground. We weren't able to pick it up because it was too crumpled apart. So the fish was officially gone at this point, day 9. There was still a mild fishy smell, at least near the spot where it fell. Day 10, we officially called it. The trout was, of course, gone from yesterday, so that wasn't relevant anymore. The chicken and lamb looked the same from, I think, 3 days ago, and the steak hadn't changed for a couple days. And there weren't any more really flies on it, despite it being a fairly sunny day today. So we just kind of decided, alright, it's about over. So we dug a hole, dumped all the meat in there. By the way, chicken was very disgusting because it left this poop, like, residue. Like, after you picked up the top skin, it was kind of just like poop on the underneath. That was the only time I really almost threw up, because I could generally stand in the sight, and it didn't smell like rot, like really at all. It was very strange. But picking it up, and the poop smell that I had to wipe off was disgusting, and again, it smelled like poop then. But we nevertheless put in a hole, buried the hole, and then threw away the remains of the paper plates, the boards, and the tape, as well as the gloves we used to put all the stuff in the hole. We're not just going to touch it with our bare hands. The fence posts I'm leaving there, because I haven't cleaned it up yet fully. I'm going to clean it up on Tuesday when the garbage comes, to be more sanitary. But the fence, or the sign things I'm leaving there to be washed off by the rain and then picked up probably also on Tuesday. But yeah, that was the end of the Stinky Meat project. We also pointed out the location. It was by a pond and a lake, so definitely very close to bodies of water, and also kind of in a very wooded area, so it's quite likely that well, probably more so the bodies of water, caused increased flies, which meant that the maggots just ate through it really quickly, which is probably why the project ended so quickly, and also is probably what at least delayed, or really stopped, let's be honest here, the rotting smell. But nevertheless, that was the Stinky Meat project. I'll post a link to the description to the official channel, where you can watch the full-length videos that go a bit more in-depth on what the meat is like, as well as a link to the Tumblr, where we have brief written descriptions for the first several days, also describing what it's like. But, nevertheless, hope you enjoyed it, and see ya.